Welcome. Good morning on the West Coast. Good day on the East Coast, and good evening in Israel. I want to welcome everybody to the Z3 emergency wartime briefing. This is the first time we're doing this, and I'm sure we'll change the name of it as we move along if we do more of these, and I'm sure we will. I'm David Hazony. I am the director and Steinhardt Senior Fellow at the Z3 Institute. Um, and I'm really thrilled to have with us Hussein Aboubakr Mansour. He is a adjunct fellow at the Z3 Institute, also a fellow at Jinsa's Gemunder Center, where his work focuses on the intersection of Arab politics, Islamist movements, and regional security architecture. Many of you know Hussein from his rapidly growing Substack and his deeply thoughtful, extended tweets. But he's also become one of the most important commentators on the Middle East, on the relationship between political Islam and the West, and on Jewish life as well. Welcome, Hussein.
Thank you, David. Glad to be here.
So let's get right down to it. We are now on day 5 of the biggest war, perhaps, of our lifetimes for many of us. I've been living in Israel for 3 decades, and for my entire lifetime, the ultimate war against Iran was something that we worried about, something that we thought of, something that we even envisioned what the future would look like afterwards. But I don't want to go too deep into the details of the combat and of the particular tactics that the militaries are using. I think a lot of that is available online, and probably most of our audience is following the war. So I want this conversation to focus a little bit more on kind of the bigger picture. You've been sort of thinking about these things from a kind of century-long perspective on how political Islam, whether it's the Shia variety in Iran or the Sunni variety through the Muslim Brotherhood, have worked for generations already to enter, infiltrate, undermine the confidence of the West. And I want to understand how do you see this war? What is this war from a long-term, big perspective?
Well, there is, of course, first of all, the immediate context of the war, and there is the larger context of the war. So if we start by the immediate context of the war, since this is probably simpler to outline, that this war practically became inevitable on the very first hours of October 7th. And the sequence of events that happened after October 7th implied this war. I mean, it was really an escalatory trajectory in which the IDF started destroying piece by piece the Iranian security architecture that the Iranians have been building for the last 30 years, which is known, or was known really, as the axis of resistance. And there was a lot of security theories about it, a ring of fire, suffocating Israel from all fronts around it, so on and so forth. But if we look at the sequence of events after October 7th, the destruction, the war in Gaza, the destruction of Hamas, even operations in Yemen, basically this war was already implied. A lot of people doubted if it will happen. I think a lot of people knew it will happen. The question always was when it will happen. And that's why the United States and Israel launched this joint operations, which with the immediate aim that people know is to completely destroy the abilities of Iran to project power, its missiles, missile stockpile, missile production facilities, missile launchers, drones, air defenses, and of course, the most important thing, probably both for Israel and the United States, is a complete destruction of the nuclear program and all of its infrastructure. And of course, there are other objectives now that are tied to this: a complete destruction of the Iranian leadership, which is also advanced quite a bit, and then ultimately now the big goal that there's a lot of confusion about, and I think the administration failed miserably in its messaging, which is basically creating the conditions for the collapse of the regime of the Islamic Republic. That's I think that's something that a lot of us want. There are fear of regime change. The word regime change itself, it terrifies a lot of people. But I think it's very clear that what the United States and Israel basically thinking, and I think the thinking is right, is that the Islamic Republic should have collapsed on its own already a long time ago if it wasn't for its strong security coercive apparatus that always saved it from collapse. We saw this wave after wave of protests. The last one, of course, in December, January was the most violent. So basically, the theory here that if you remove that coercive power, the Islamic Republic will collapse on its own, and that's I think that's what we're operating on. Now, there is a larger context of this war, which is kind of similar in terms of this war also was to some degree inevitable, since actually the Islamic Republic has been actively at war with both Israel, the United States, and actually the West at large since its founding following the Islamic Revolution in 1979. Everybody knows this regime. I mean, this audience, of course, knows. I don't need to reiterate this. Death to America, death to Israel. All of basically the Iranian conspiracies all across the West, Europe, targeting of whether Jewish community centers, Israeli diplomatic missions, different countries from India to Turkey to Western Europe to the United States, killing Iranian dissidents, all this out of their borders. I haven't even touched what they have been doing regionally yet. In the past 30 years, Iran emerged as one of these central powers in the Middle East that is in direct, basically, a war with the United States and all of its allies. Now, the United States did the nuclear program, of course, was the peak of all of these efforts. Now, the United States, starting from the Bush administration, going through the Bush, from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, to the first Trump administration, to the Biden administration, have had a lot of shifts and approaches on how to deal and contain Iran. With the Bush administration, they were called the axis of evil, but ultimately after the war in Iraq, actually we tried to work with them given the rising power in Iraq, which often pissed up a lot of our Arab allies and really resulted in Iran acquiring massive strategic depth inside Iraq itself, turning it into the first block into what became really that regional axis that then Iran was able later to link with Hezbollah on the Mediterranean and Israel's borders. Then you had, of course, the Obama administration, which had the most disastrous and catastrophic approach, not just because it immediately dealt with tactically trying to contain Iran. It actually had a massive strategic shift in American thinking that basically we should partner with Iran. Iran, we're not a superpower. We don't deal with power. We're really system managers. The problem is that Iran is not cooperating with the system. If we give them something nice, if we give them something that we want, let them enrich some uranium, remove sanctions, try to work with them there, we'll actually get them to cooperate with the system. This was a disastrous policy, empowered Iran, give them billions of dollars, as everybody knows. It was met with a lot of opposition from all the regional allies of the United States, including both Israel and Arab countries. And that was already the beginning of the unraveling of a lot of the trust in American policy in the region itself. Now, afterwards, everybody knows, I think we don't need to reiterate what happened with the Trump administration, the Biden administration, but basically this was going to happen inevitably. Best case scenario, short of this war, was that the Islamic Republic would have ended somehow on its own. And I think people had that hope every time they watched a wave of protests in Iran. Is this it? Finally, the Islamic Republic will be removed. But I think most sound and sane people knew that there is basically no coexistence with this regime. So it would have been either them collapsing or us ultimately having to go head to head with them, which is really what happened last Saturday.
So, look, I think I wrote about the Obama administration I was in Washington during the time of the Iran deal. I think that there was a lot of confusion, and there still is a lot of confusion in the United States about who the enemy is, because, if you spend too much time online like I do, you're constantly bombarded with, no, it's China, no, it's Qatar, no, it's Russia. and the failure to kind of articulate a coherent foe is something that's taken advantage of by every single one of these sides and was taken advantage of by the Obama administration. I think when one of the weirdest aspects that I needed to write about at the time was the ISIS war, where the administration came out against ISIS and went to war against ISIS. And I kept feeling like this has something to do with the Iran deal. Uh, Americans seeing Iran and America fighting side by side against ISIS was I felt like it was part of it. But I think that the best thing service we can do to our listeners is to try to make sense of the complexity of the foes of the West, of the enemies of the West. So, for example, we know that Iran wasn't just a menace to the region. A decade ago, we were reading about Hezbollah, which is an Iranian proxy, spreading itself into South America. There was even a case of a criminal case in the United States of people running cigarettes, and it turned out that the money was going to Hezbollah. It was a huge business operation, bringing in $1 billion a year outside of the money they got from Iran. And that's not to speak of Europe and their and the possibility of sleeper cells and all of these things. At the same time, we also have a world of Sunni Islamism that we talk about. ISIS was part of that, perhaps. We see it with the Muslim Brotherhood. We see it with the sort of massive Qatari investments in the United States. And Qatar has really become a Muslim Brotherhood nation in the last 20 years. And I think that part of me feels that there's a real deep connection between this Shia Islamist threat and this Sunni Islamist threat. Um, how does this war affect that? We see, for example, right now, we're talking about Qatar possibly taking up arms against Iran. Iran is hitting Qatar. Iran's not hitting Turkey. I don't know why. We can talk about that. But Iran is hitting Qatar, which has played this double game for a very long time. Um, do you think the outcome of this war? Let's imagine the regime falls. It feels very plausible today to say that within a week or a month or 6 months, the Islamic Republic of Iran will be no more, and there will be a new Iranian pro-Western Iranian regime there. What happens to Qatar? Qatar shares a massive natural gas field with the Iranians. Qatar hosts Hamas leaders, whichever ones are left. Um, uh, does Qatar suddenly, and by the way, we've even seen Al Jazeera changing its coverage in real time to be very
Right.
anti-Iran. Al Jazeera being the foremost way that Qatar directly influences conversation in the West. What happens to that whole machinery in the absence of an Islamic Republic of Iran?
It's a great question. Let me establish some background first before actually I can
Yeah.
get into that. For the people who follow my work and read my Substack, I love to develop actually cohesive but counterintuitive and contrarian answers to the questions that people have been thinking about these things, whether the history of Islamism and jihadism, and also the Sunni and Shia split. Sunni and Shia, kind of this eternal war between the Sunnis and the Shia, it didn't actually start before the rise of the Islamic Republic, and this is something that people forgotten, people projected back, and that's kind of part of the problems with dealing in the Middle East. The thick of ideology is just, or the blankets of ideology are so thick, just such this huge cloud, that people often really forget. The world of Islamism, before it did split into Shia and Sunni variants, was actually, let's call it, it was a single idea. It wasn't actually made different ideas that are developed in other places. No, in the 20th century, really ideas that gave rise to the thought that ultimately culminated in the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and then of course the globalization of the Muslim Brotherhood now that's by no means just an Egyptian movement, and ultimately also to the Islamic Republic itself. It was actually the same conditions, the same ideas. If you go even to the intellectual origins of the Islamic Republic, you'll find that some of its most important ideologues, Ali Shariati, namely, started his career by translating Egyptian books that were written at the time about Islam and Islamism and things of that sort. The Islamic Republic itself, the Islamic Revolution, when it happened, it had an enthusiastic support from not just Foucault, who's probably the most famous supporter of the Islamic Republic at this moment, or Salman Rushdie, who did support it at the time, but also from almost all Islamist movements or nascent Islamist movement at the time in the region, including the Sunni Islamist movements, and even nationalist and other movement, revolutionary movements. Arafat was the first foreign leader to actually travel into Tehran, and everybody knows the story of receiving the theatrics of receiving the keys of the Israeli embassy and so on. And Iran became the model, the proof of concept that Islamism could work. And notice here I'm saying Islamism, I'm not saying Shia Islamism, I'm saying Islamism. That you actually can fuse finally this hybrid modern ideology with state power in a way that is able to resist the surrounding regime, able to resist the West, and able to be at war, declare war for the liberation of Palestine and Israel. And this, by the way, has been the case for a very long time. As a matter of fact, the fanning of Shia Sunni hatred was really, for the most part, or in many parts, it was really a defensive strategy by Arab regimes who were exactly afraid of this. And they wanted to build basically an impenetrable wall between their own populations that are mostly Sunni and this now rising world of Islamism in the Shia world. And saying that they are Shia and we're Sunni and we hate each other was really a very convenient way. Jews, by the way, have a version of they have actually a good understanding of this, that part of the instrumentality of Israel in Arab politics or anti-Semitism is to really insulate Arab population from actually how Israel actually is, so they may not want democracy. I think this idea does circulate in Jewish circles, and there is some truth to it. Think about the Shia Sunni thing, exactly kind of almost served as the same strategy. So to go back to what you said, yes, actually the world of Islamism is much more unified than people think ideologically, even with its differences. And we saw this, by the way, till very, very recently with Hamas. Hamas is a Sunni movement, and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is a Sunni movement. They are the children of Iran. They are funded by Iran. They are supported by Iran. Not just Iran. Hamas, before Qatar, their headquarter office was in Damascus. That was ruled by Alawites, and basically it was a client state of the Iranians for a very, very long time. So the world of Islamism, its relations are much more complex than people think. And this is also maybe one point before I move to the answer your question about Qatar, that also brings us to the issue of jihadism. People make a distinction, and they should, between, let's say, the Muslim Brotherhood movement, which is still awful, but between straight out nihilistic jihadis like ISIS. It's true, but that doesn't mean that they are separate. Actually, they flow into each other. There is an ambiguous border area in which ultimately all of this world of Islamist movements and governments is linked. Now, where does this leave Qatar? First of all, the honest question, no one knows what's going to happen after this war, but one of the things to think about, Qatar, for the past 30 years, have built probably the most successful small state strategy in modern history, if at all, to punch significantly above its weight and become one of the most influential states in the region and in the world, with a very tiny piece of land, very, very tiny population. This strategy had 5 pillars, let's say. The first pillar of them was actually having a close relationship with Iran, both Iran and the United States, hedging and balancing between of them, hosting al-Udeid, at the same time being the number one friend of Iran in the Gulf. This, by the way, helped Qatar a lot, not just making them a valuable mediator between Iran and the West, but let's remember when the Arab or Gulf blockade against Qatar took place in 2017, it was actually the Iranians who saved the Qataris. That's where the Qataris were able to buy their food, get their medicine, and so on and so forth, and they survive the blockade exactly because of their relationship with Qatar. Now, the other pillars of the strategy, Al Jazeera and the media empire that they have built that basically control the populist, pro-Islamist and anti-Western, anti-Israel sentiment in the Arab street, gives them huge influence in oversized influence in Arab politics. You have another pillar, which is the patronizing of Islamist movements, mainly the Muslim Brotherhood all across the region, also give them an unbelievable strategic and political depth in many societies, to the extent that the tiny nation of Qatar can destabilize the largest Arab country and the most important 20th century Arab country was at least Egypt, and this we saw this exactly happening. And you have the pillar, of course, of the partnership with Western elites, patronizing and being basically an employer of a very prestigious employer, very well paying. I heard about the benefits that professors get when they go to Qatar, and trust me, they don't fly a coach. They have very nice gigs. I mean, they are a major employer of really Western elite jobs. Professors, journalists, lobbyists. These things matter. Those are big paychecks. So all of this together formed this cohesive strategy that Qatar worked on for 30 years that made them what they are today. They made them able to do everything that they were able to do, get away with everything that they were getting away with. Now, this strategy is unraveling in real time. The Qataris are shooting at them. They caused them to shut down their gas production, which is really the base of their power and their wealth. And now the Qataris, as you said, are shooting back. And Al Jazeera has to talk about Iran with the same language that it has been reserving for Israel for the past 30 years. Now, in a longer context, since October 7th, there are multiple things that are happening. The assets of Islamism that Qatar has been using for a very long time are actually depreciating also in real time. Where's Hamas today? Where's Hezbollah? Where is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad? Now, couple this with the massive reputational shock that Qatar received in the West, where it spends a lot of money, as we said, on its reputation and its influence there. Yes, they still have influence. Yes, they still have investment with the Witkoffs and the Kushners that makes them still influential. But look at what people think of Qatar today in many Western circles. Not to mention, of course, the after October 7th that basically have a clear understanding on the Israel side and also on the American Jewish side that really Qatar is at war with the Jewish people. This translates itself in actual activities, by the way, through, for example, American Jewish community organizations that now actually invest resources in researching, documenting, and calling out what Qatar is doing. We have there is now almost regular congressional hearings about Qatari influence, about Qatari funding to the universities. This is not happening to any country. Now, Qatar is
essentially what you're saying is that Qatar's whole strategy worked, but it was based on nobody noticing them.
Nobody noticing what they're doing.
As long as nobody noticed them, they could expand their power and influence across the world.
Right. But now, as I said, like everybody notices, if you go on the ADL website, if you go on the AGC website, as I said, we're talking about regular congressional hearings. We're talking about investigations by the federal government. Texas A&M canceling contracts. Brown University canceling partnership. So the Qataris now, first of all, they are seeing the strategy collapsing and unraveling. At the same time, it's probably an opportunity for them to make some movements if they really want to reinvent themselves. This is only one possibility.
And people, by the way, don't know, and it's important to add this context. You said the last 30 years.
Right.
Before that, Qatar was actually pro-Western. It was one of the first countries in the 90s to open an Israeli interest office. Right. They had been moving in the same direction as the UAE and to a less extent the Saudis. And at a certain point, they flipped.
Right.
I guess the big question is, could they flip back?
They could. The Qataris were actually the pioneers, diplomatic and political pioneers for a very long time. And as you said, they actually made the first open visit by an Israeli official to an Arab Gulf country. It was actually Shimon Peres in the early 90s, who actually went to Qatar. There is a video that you can watch in him actually walking around in Doha, which just kind of seems very weird that this happened. Now, how they flipped, there's a lot of reasons of this. A lot of this has to do with the first Gulf War. Also, it has to do with the relations with Saudi Arabia. All the small Gulf countries, their number one fear, by the way, is to be swallowed up by Saudi, since it's the big Arab neighbor. The number one priority of all of these states is to assert independence against Saudi Arabia. This, by the way, applies to also the Emirates as much as it does applies to Qatar. So this has always been part of that. Could they switch back? They could. I mean, they have a massive infrastructure that they have acquired. I think it will be hard, but also that infrastructure itself will help them do that strategic pivot again if they choose. I imagine that there will be some hurdles inside the royal family because there are members of the royal family who are actually bought into this Islamist ideological drivel. I mean, they are not very powerful. They are not, but they are definitely there. And then, of course, you are now the biggest employer of all Islamist and Arabist and leftist intellectuals and media production figures in the Middle East. I mean, all of them now in Doha. Are they going to just follow your pivot, or are you going to fire everybody and get new people? There are challenges, but it's possible. But also there are other possibilities. I mean, this is not the Qataris are also extremely savvy, and maybe they also don't want to lose that influence, and they will figure out another way after the collapse of Iran to rebalance themselves in order to maintain their privileged position in Washington against the UAE and against Saudi.
Okay, let's turn back to the Iranian side of the war. And really, I mean, I don't think any of us have ever imagined or really believed that we would kind of see this moment come. I think we have, if you take it from a Middle Eastern perspective, American 4 years is a very short period of time from a Middle Eastern decision-making perspective, and you have an American superpower that keeps changing its leadership every 4 years, and that's a very, very difficult thing to constantly be renavigating, not to mention Israel, which has risen dramatically in power in the last generation, and also changes its leadership in theory every few years. So, um, so we see this all crumbling down from the Iranian perspective. Um, we're in a period where inside the United States, you have movements, elite and grassroots or grass tops or however you want to call it, that are funded, right? The money comes from somewhere. Part of it is coming from Qatar. Part of it apparently was coming from Iran. Part of it's coming from China. Okay. Um, do is there, and I'll just add one more thing. I've always felt that the Middle East and power in general, but especially the Middle East, there's a concept of momentum. Okay. People put their finger in the wind all the time to see which way the wind is blowing.
Right.
All right. Um, we're now in a moment where and we're seeing this all over the world, right? The United States took out Maduro and struck the Iranian nuclear sites, and Israel even went as far as firing a missile into Qatar. These military and quasi-military operations are creating this massive shift. Okay, that American power is rising from the
Right.
Panama Canal to Cuba to I would not be at all surprised if we see a fundamental shift in Russia's relationship to the negotiations over the Ukraine war in the wake of the collapse of Iran. We see China increasingly on the defensive now, losing cheap access to Iranian cheap oil, if that's what happens, not to mention Venezuelan oil. So all of this is shifting, and there is a huge sense of momentum.
Right.
Um, and this administration is only a little bit into its second year out of four. I mean, a lot is happening quickly, and may continue to happen. How does that do we see responses to that shift in momentum? A in the Islamist global Islamism as it expresses itself in Europe. B, especially interesting to me, is in the United States. Are we going to see fewer demonstrations and fewer politicians bought? And I mean, and when I say bought, I want to be really clear. Qatar buys influence on both sides of the aisle.
Right.
Qatar buys influence throughout Washington. When I was There was a big piece this is a decade ago when I was in Washington that Lee Smith published his expose on Martin Indyk at the Brookings Institution receiving $14 million from Qatar. Um, the the influence that we've seen and the agitation, public agitation and constant state of sense of crisis. Somebody pointed out that it's really bizarre that all the ICE protests suddenly switched into pro-Iran protests. Or when in Times Square last week, the anti-war people had the exact same signs as the protesters from a few weeks earlier. It's very clear that this is, at
Right.
least from a funding standpoint, but also from an organizational standpoint, there are hands moving, and they aren't exclusively Qatari or Iranian,
Right.
okay, but they're hands that are moving. Are we going to see a shift in momentum expressing itself very soon?
Well, as you said, it's not only Qatar. Just very quickly, it's not only Qatar and Iran. Turkey is, I imagine, Turkey is heavily involved in a lot of this. China, of course, and Russia are heavily involved in this. Just by the nature of Western societies, by the nature of social media and the transformations that social media brought, I think there was a lot of incentives for a lot of states today to try to manipulate Western public opinion. And I'm not here talking about direct lobbying or buying people, which does happen. It's entirely different. But no, the actual manipulation of public opinion is already happening through major right-wing figure in the West. And I think no sane person is under the impression that what Tucker Carlson went through in the past year is completely autonomous and didn't actually have any external support. I don't foresee, first of all, a lot of these changes as well, or a lot of these events have to do with internal dynamics to Western societies that have to do with our own crises. So let's remember this. So the problem exists on both sides, on the supply side and on the demand side. On the demand side, you have all of these states. Even if Qatar changes its strategy tomorrow, there is absolutely no reason on earth that they should stop buying people and buying institutions and buying influence here. And they are not the only ones doing it. The Saudis are doing it. The
Right,
Emiratis.
but the direction of that
The
influence,
direction, yeah,
could be different.
could be different or not. I mean, it could be
Yeah.
also a balancing a balancing act. Second, actually, as you mentioned something I think very important, which is the rising power of Israel. This is true. I think this is this is the strongest the state of Israel has been in its history. Now we're really it's an unique moment in terms of its power, confidence, and influence. What this does is that it makes populist anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism more salient, not less. That is, if you think about it from a state perspective, from a strategic perspective, it is one way to contain, confront, and undermine that state that you can't actually compete with its power. This is, by the way, what the Saudis had just started doing right before this war. I mean, it's actually quite funny that we had this huge thing that happened a month ago, started happening, and then this war came and reshuffled everything. But basically, I mean, it really started from shortly after October 7th, picked up really in June 2014 and 2024, and then really it took its full force in December 2025, which is basically sorry, June. It took a major shift in June 2024, 2025 with the first round of strikes against Iran. But really, with the Saudi operations in Yemen, you really saw a massive strategic shift in terms of Saudi Arabia, its policy towards the UAE, its policy in pursuing normalization, and its rhetoric. I mean, we saw Saudi media heavily reinvesting in anti-Zionist rhetoric targeting the UAE and so on. The reason that the Saudis did this is not because MBS all of a sudden woke up one morning and decided, no, 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 you know what, I need to adopt this amazing ideas once again. This is not what happened. What happened is the Saudis looked around. What is the Middle East going to look like after Iran? The Emiratis are getting everything. They are allied with the Israelis. Do we really need the Israelis this much? Israel now is the most powerful military in the region. Nobody compete with them. What is the best way to contain them? Keep them a pariah state. So we're not going to have normalization with them. We're gonna condition that on a Palestinian state that we know they cannot deliver, and then we're going to use the media. It was just a strategic
I
calculation.
mean, or put it another way, it also the Saudi rapprochement to Israel begins in earnest with the Iran deal,
with Iran. Right,
right? The Iran deal comes, they're more afraid of Iran than of Israel,
right,
and that pushes them in the direction of Israel. The moment
right.
Iran is weakened and possibly gotten rid of, then that force that pushes them towards Israel is gone.
It's not just gone. It
Yeah.
alters the relationship
Right.
with Israel from a potential asset into a competitor and
Right.
into a rival. So that makes investment in anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist rhetoric and obsessions very valuable. And that means they are valuable to invest to in the West, which is much more open society. You can
Right.
actually get to people and fund them and so on. And what applies to the geopolitical level applies on the global level. Now we're getting actually a lot of reports about how much anti-Semitism China has been actually pushing in
Hmm.
the past 2 years. And by
Right.
the way, I have no doubt that the leadership of the Chinese CCP couldn't care less or
No.
know anything about Jews or Judaism or no. This is just it's the number one. It's the most important ally of the
Right.
United States and the Middle East. They are rising power. This is a one way to undermine America.
So I
Now,
want to, before we're going to start running out of time soon. I want to make sure that there is one more player that you mentioned briefly, Turkey, and I'm seeing a lot of people every couple of days. I see somebody on Twitter say, pay attention to Turkey. Once Iran's
right,
gone, Turkey's going to be the big deal. I'm Turkey is obviously also playing its own double game. It's a member of NATO. It's been very vicious in its rhetoric against Israel. When the regime in Syria collapsed, a lot of people were worried about a confrontation, a military confrontation between Israeli forces and Turkish forces that have been
right,
sitting in part of Syria. Israel didn't was no sucker there. Started blowing up all sorts of things, and Turkey doesn't act like somebody that actually wants to go to war with Israel. But is that a real like again, Turkey is another example of a country that flipped, right? Erdogan was
right,
originally elected as a democratic leader and in a pro Israel Turkey, and then he took it into a more Muslim Brotherhood Islamist direction.
right.
Um, where does that go, especially in a post Islamic Republic of Iran world?
Right. Well, I want to remind everybody we're conditioning on this on that Iran will collapse, right? We don't know. Hopefully, this is what's going to happen. I don't think the Israelis and the Americans are going to stop this war before some at least serious long-term damage is done to the Islamic Republic. But there are other options that also may change a lot of calculations. That is,
Hmm.
somehow the regime survives and still menaces the region, or that the regime changes and gets another regime that is, it's not necessarily going to be a democratic, it's going to be something like Sisi's Egypt. So authoritarian military, but it's ready to talk to Israel, ready to talk to the United States and its Arab neighbors. That also will change a lot of
A
things.
military coup seems actually one of the more likely outcomes.
A coup inside the IRGC, and then basically
No,
you
not the
still
IRGC.
have
I'm talking about the Artesh,
the
the
regular
regular
army,
army.
yeah,
Yeah.
that could be true. Now, if that happens, that also changes the possibilities that Turkey have because you still have Iran, you still have somewhat an Iran that could actually check some of this Turkey activity. The idea that the next coming threat is likely going to be at some sort of an axis of Turkey involved Sunni Islamism, I think it's a logical idea. I don't think it's exactly going to play out. But I think basically, if you look at the history of the region since the end of World War II, which is really kind of the beginning of the post-colonial Middle East, that's when you get the state of Israel. That's when you get all of the modern Arab states. So you get Arab nationalism and so on and so forth. You will find basically that you had the first revolutionary era of basically that had the hegemonic ambition of Egypt and then the Ba'athist states that really did menace the Middle East for their time. And then as they declined, Iran really rose and kind of took that mantle. So now with the possibility of Iran falling, I think the logical question is to think, all right, what is coming next? Somebody's going to try to fill that vacuum. So it's I think one of the main candidates is indeed this Islamist Turkey axis. I think there's another strong possibility that we should also put in mind that no one actually manages to fill that vacuum. Turkey doesn't have the resources. Their economy is not doing well. They're overextended in a lot of places. Erdogan is going to die recently. Ultimately, what he's done is he Islamized the Turkish state. But I think there's still a lot of resistance in Turkish society itself. And Turkish statism is also as deep if not as deep now as the Islamist sentiment in the government. So we don't know how much of this going to play out. Also, remember that Arabs are also involved, and Arabs, by the way, dislike the Turks exactly as much as they dislike the Persians. So there is a possibility that basically no one in the current constellation of power will be able to consolidate some sort of a bloc that exercises some sort of amount of hegemony on the region. And that means you're going to have a prolonged period of just competition and conflicts being conducted and managed and for a very long time in different places, which is, I think that's likely. We've already have the beginning of that. You have now Egypt, Turkey, UAE, Saudi Arabia, for instance, all of them involved in the conflict in Sudan, involved in the Horn of Africa to one degree, and Israel, of course.
And Israel now.
Yeah, it's involved in the Horn of Africa. So here you see direct competition between all of these middle powers on who's going to control the most important kind of nodes and determine the end state of a lot of these conflicts in the Middle East. So this could basically just actually what's going to continue for a period of time. If Turkey rises, basically you're going to have some sort of an Islamist. The interesting thing to watch: where will Qatar be from this? Will they actually join that basically transform their network, and that's kind of seemed more likely given their current orientation already, and join something with Turkey to try to consolidate some influence, especially on Lebanon. Syria, a post-Iran Iraq becomes really now a playground for competition for all of these powers. I think it's a possibility. I'm not sure that Turkey has the resources, but I know for a fact that they do have the ambition.
Listen, this has been an amazing, mind-blowing conversation. I really wish we could continue for another hour or two because I have a whole lot more questions, but we are out of time. So I really want to thank you so much, Hussein. Once again, Hussein Aboubakr Mansour is a fellow at the Z3 Institute, as well as is in ISGAP, and does a lot of writing. And I'm David Hazony, director of the Z3 Institute, and it's really been amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye.